this video, I'll be demonstrating how to make the Smart Doll jacket, and I'll show you an easy way to make the lapel collar. So all the pattern pieces are going to be laid out on the fabric. This is the grain line, so make sure that when you lay out your pieces, you pay attention to the grain line and place your pieces on the lengthwise grain, which is it's going to be parallel to the selvage of the fabric, and all the pieces have the same grain line except for the under collar, which is going to be basically at a 45-degree angle, because you're going to place this line on your grain line. So your main collar is going to be placed like this along the grain line, and this one like that, so that they're both parallel. Next, I'm going to mark my notches by taking little snips at each notch and all the notches, because this is they're important when you're matching your pieces together. And the first piece that we're going to put together is going to be the back. So let me just put everything to the side and start working on the back. The back side is going to be attached to the front, but first we have to do the center seam here on the back. So I'm going to sew this seam, which is 1/4 of an inch. I already measured it, from here and stop where the slit is going to be, and then start again where the slit ends and seam down. I'm going to be seaming it first, and the reason I seam it first is because I want to make sure that my seam is exactly how this seam is going to be, because I don't mark it, but you can mark it and serge first the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to seam it and then open it up and serge each side individually, so that you have your opening in the back for the stand. I sewed the two back pieces together. First I sewed them, then I pressed the seam, and then I went to the serger and finish each seam individually. You can always zigzag it or use the pinking shears, and I made sure I left the opening. And after I'm done attaching the sides, I'll top stitch along the opening just to hold those two pieces down. You don't have to do it, but on the pattern it calls for it, and these patterns are really, really good. So I did all my notches on the sides, and I'll be attaching the sides to the back. I start by pinning everything. First I pin the top edge, and then I find my notches, match your notches, because that's the reason why you did them in the first place. I sewed the back, sides, and I serged, finished my seam by serging. And I pushed the seam towards that side, press the seam towards that side, because I'm pretty sure that's what these little arrows mean. Just to push your seams that way. So next we're gonna do the front. Let's put this to the side for now. And on my pattern pieces, it doesn't call for any top stitching except for where the slit is, which I already did that. I did it with a color that matches the fabric, so it's kind of hard to see. But that just holds down the seams. So the front we're gonna do the same way. Make sure you're using the front, because the facing piece almost looks like that. And then mark your little notches. Right sides together, facing each other. Pin your sides, and then sew. So I just want to mention that this fabric is stretchy, so it's easy to ease around the curve. But if you have a fabric that's not stretchy, to put the straight curve to the curve, all you have to do is, like, once you match your notches, just make little sips on the fabric so that this opens up like that, and it's easier to sew. I finished my fronts to the side, and I pressed the seam goes towards the front of the jacket, because the next step is going to be a top stitching along that line. You could go ahead and top stitch it all the way to the bottom. For my top stitching, I just use my edge foot, and I move my needle to where I want to do the top stitch, and I just follow it along in the machine. I'm moving my needle to where I want my top stitch to be. If you don't have this type of foot or a machine that you can move your needle, you can just use a regular foot and just follow one of the edges along just to make it even. The tricky part is the curve, and I'm being very careful. I'm looking at this here to make sure that it's even with the curve. And take your time. Okay, so our fronts are done, our back is done, and the next step is going to be to attach the back to the front at the shoulders. Now that our back is attached to our front, we're going to start working on the collar. So the first step I'm going to do with the collar is I'm going to attach, first of all, I marked my under collar. And I'm going to do the little snips as well. This NP, that stands for neck point. Or shoulder point, whatever you want to call it. These markings are very important. Because you want the collar to look like this. See, you're going to attach the collar later on up to here. And then over here, there's a pivot line. It pivots and it's a little square. But the first thing we're going to do is put them, the collar and the under collar, right sides kissing each other. And the first seam we're going to do is the one right across the top of the collars. And I marked my under collar because after that I'll be folding the facing down towards the under collar and make a top stitch along that line so the collar folds nicely. I'll show you before I do it. But first I'm going to go ahead and seam the top off camera. I put my collar pieces together and I didn't pin it quite well and I ended up with something like this. So I'm going to undo, pick that seam line and make sure my seams are matching, because the collar and the under collar, they're not exactly the same size, I think. So this is much better. Your seams should match. And then I'm going to trim this to about an 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to top stitch, pushing the seam towards the under collar, just next to that seam line. And once again, your under collar is the one that's cut on the bias because it has more stretch. And then once you do that seam, it'll lay down nicely. Okay, I finished stitching across the top of the collar, and I did my top seam along the under collar with the facing towards the under collar. This is what it looks like. See how nicely that folds? On the back you should see the stitching and a little tiny lip of the upper collar. So the next step is going to be seaming this side right here. This part is going to be left open. So from the top all the way to that little point right there, that's going to be your seam on each side. When you're folding it over, fold it over the back stitching. So it's going to look like this. And sew from there to that point right there. You can mark it. And the way I mark it is I just stick a pin in the on the line right there, and just make a little dot so I know where to stop. Right where the pin is. Do the same thing for the other side and sew both sides. I sewed my collar on each side just up to that point right there. And now I'm going to trim the little corner here and trim that seam, being careful not to cut this seam because this is important. You need to measure it. So I'm going to make a little clip there and cut my seam. Just to get rid of the bulk so I can turn it around. Same thing on this side. And then we're gonna flip it. I did some back stitches here so that when you're flipping it, it doesn't come undone. And just with your point turner, make a nice little point there. And you're gonna end up with something like so. Same thing on the other side. So go ahead and press it, and then you're gonna top stitch starting from that little point there. You can go further down, it's okay. All the way across, coming to the next side. Just making sure that the seam stays towards the outside. So I'm gonna seam top stitch, all the way across, and then down to the other side. So to attach the collar to the jacket, first we're going to attach the under collar to the jacket. That's why we left it open there. And make sure you mark this point here on the collar, and also mark that point, this one, along with your notch on the front of the suit, because we're going to attach the collar under collar with the right side facing each other. I start at the back, center, and start pinning there. And then the shoulders, match the little notches at the shoulders. This is a really nice fabric because it's a denim, but it's lightweight and it stretches, so it makes it easy to attach things along curves. I don't have to make little snips in order to make it the curved side fit the collar. And I'm going to attach it. I folded the seam lines towards the front. The pattern actually tells you to fold them to the back. So just to follow along with the pattern, I'm going to do that. And then you're going to match that little corner there with the marking that you did on your dress jacket, and then pin it right there. Make sure that the notches are matching, because when we sew, we're going to sew from that point to the other point. So the same thing, I don't think you can really see the markings on the camera, but they are marked. And that's the way I do it. I just follow my little markings and put a pin there so that it's nice and even, and then pin the rest of the way. And remember, you're going to sew from point to point, leaving the side seam still open. We'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll attach the collar to the facing. Okay, I've sewn the collar point to point along here, this point to this point, the under collar. Oops, this point to this point. And now we're gonna attach the facings. But before we attach the facing, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna serge the parts that are gonna be open. Serge up on the top, the side here, and along the curve. And that's all you're gonna do for now. So let's put this aside and do this, and then I'll show you how to attach the collar to the facing. And that's almost the last step for doing the collar. My facings are serged, and now I just want to mark that little point again on the facing. And on this fabric, I tried using white pencil to mark, and my markings were not showing, so I'm using a black heat erasable pen. So that's my little point right there. Same thing on the other side. That's the point for here. And I marked the point on the collar already. So we're going to get started sewing the collar onto the facing. So you're going to take your facings, the shoulder facing in and this side facing out, and attach it to the collar, starting at that point that we did right here, and at the point where the collar, where that corner of the collar meets. So here's my little point, and then I'm going to match that to this point. because we're gonna sew it along here on the collar. So leaving this end open like we did for the bodice. So my shoulders are matching. And do the same thing for the other side. So face it this way. Find your point on the collar. Find your point on the corner here. And pin. So that's where I'm going to start my seam. And then pin across. So now we're going to sew on this side from this point up to here, up to all the way up to the end of where your facing is. In other words, this is what we're really doing, is attaching the collar from here to here, like this. So I'll go ahead and do that. Point to the end. From this point to the end. So here it is. This is what you should have so far. I sewed it from point. I sewed all the way across because this will help me. This is going to be folded in. And that sewing line, I can follow that sewing line to this point. So this is what you should have so far. The sides are still open. But we have the top collar and the under collar all nicely finished. So I'm going to go ahead and press my seams. All my collar seams are going to be pressed towards the top because they're going to be hidden by the facing. And then this facing is going to be attached to the shoulder here. You can attach it by machine or you can attach it by hand, whatever way is easier for you. Now we're going to work on closing the collar on the front and making this seam the last seam on the collar. Okay, so at this point I've pressed my seams just so it's easier to work with everything. And what we're going to do is we're going to flip the facings over, and right here where that little lip is not stitched, that's what we're going to stitch to this side. So in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to make a little snip at the corner. And the way I do it is I'm going to make sure that this seam and this seam are matching right here. That they stop at the same point. And like right here, it doesn't look like I stopped at the same point. So I'm going to go ahead and make that stitch so that actually they did stop at the same point. See there? And then the other one, I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure that this is nice and flat. Make sure that they match. And that my seams are going to meet at the same point. Okay, and now where that pin is, which is the point, the pivot point, let me just get rid of that little string. I don't know if you've noticed, but I don't like hanging strings. I cut them off immediately. So right there, where the seam is, we're gonna make a little slit on an angle. Before I do that, I want to make sure this one is right because it doesn't seem like it's at the right angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew it flat up to here so that on both sides they meet. This one is perfect. See how it's right at that angle? So let me go ahead and correct that before I start sewing. And remember, your collar is nice and flat on that side when you're doing this part. Okay, now I know my stitches are gonna meet exactly. My stitches are gonna meet exactly because I did a little reinforcement stitch here at that point, and also at this point with the collar flat. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a little slit right here over the facing, only on the facing side, almost till the point of stitching, but don't cut the collar at all. Same thing on the other side. I'm going to make that little slit. That's going to help me pivot. Being very careful not to cut your stitches. If you cut your stitches, you're in trouble. You have to do it all over again. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to pivot that whole thing to catch this. And then I should have marked that, but this is where the end of your collar is going to be, on this line right here. I didn't want to clip it because you have to be so careful, and I don't want to stretch it out. So I'm just going to mark it with a pen, or maybe I can just mark it with a, mark it over here. So you just have to take your time doing this, and you'll see how beautiful it's going to turn out. So now I'm going to pivot that whole thing over like that, and my collar is going to get caught here. The end of the collar that hasn't been sewn. So pivot that. And just make sure that these parts are even. Pin them. And make sure that you're catching that end of the collar. Then you're gonna sew from this point right here all the way across. Same thing on the other side. Pivot. So the next step is mark this or pin it and sew along that line. And the same way on this side. So I did the seams across the front on both sides. I flipped them over temporarily to make sure that this matches the other seam. Okay, and for the sleeves, the same process. Clip your points. And then this just indicates a little stitch. You can do a stitch just above the seam line, and so you can gather it a little bit to ease this part into the armhole. I don't think I need to do it with this fabric because it's stretchy, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start attaching it, pinning it. And notice that it has a front side and a back side, so make sure you put them to the correct sides. I pin my sleeve to the armhole opening, but I'm also going to baste it and then remove the pins for sewing it, because I feel like there's too many pins and it'll be harder for me when I'm at the sewing machine. So I'll just baste it all along. All around, and then I'll sew it and remove the basting stitch at the end. So now that the the sleeves are done and serged, I will be doing the hems. I've already marked them, the hems on the sleeve. So I've marked them. I'm going to serge the bottom edge and then fold it up on the mark that I made and do a top stitching along the sleeve for the hem. So I serged the hem and I pressed it on the fold. Then I'm going to make sure that both sides are going to match. Just kind of measure it from arm or from notch and make sure that both hems are going to match. Here's where you make any adjustments that you need to make, and then you pin it and stitch it along the top. Here's the hem all finished on the sleeves. And before we close the sides, we want to do everything as flat as possible. So here, to finish the front, on that mark right there, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to make a little slit where that mark was. And this is so I can do the understitching. So for the bottom section, I'm going to do the understitching here with the facing, with the seam towards the facing. And I'm going to do a little top stitch along that line, catching the seam. And then for the top part, since this part goes this way, I'm going to flip the seam away from the facing and do a little, I guess it's called an understitching because that's what we're doing. We're stitching under over this section right here, just so that it lays nice and flat. It'll lay nice and flat this way, and it'll lay nice and flat that way when you divide the sections the way that I explained it. So we're going to do that on each side, each front, and then we can work on closing the side. So my understitching is done. And this is what I mean. So the understitching on the bottom part, it's really hard to see, I think. But there's a line right there of understitching. It's right over catching the seam. So the facing side facing towards the facing, and the top side, I only did it as far as I could go. It's catching the facing on this side, so that when you turn it, when you fold your collar, you're not going to see that on the top, but it's going to make the collar roll really nicely, and the bottom as well. So the next step is going to be to put the sides together and sew them. So as always, I'm going to pin them, making sure that I'm matching my seams, matching my notches. I finished the side seams, and before I serged, I took a peek to make sure that my underarm seams were matching, and they were, so I went ahead and this one doesn't match 100%, but close enough. And then I went ahead and serged. And as far as serger tails, this is the only time that you have to hide your serger tail, because otherwise it'll just stick out when you flip it over. So I'm gonna hide my serger tail. I have a needle that's bigger than this one, and it's easier to do, but I can't find it. So I have to do it this way. I just put the blunt needle through the seam, and I pull my tail out. And see, that hides it nicely. You can also use something like freight check, but I don't like using that for my doll clothes. Okay, so the next step is I'm gonna flip this over, and these are kind of hard to flip, so I have this that I bought at Menards, and I just use that to flip my seams. After I'm done with the with everything, with the top stitching and everything, I'm going to take this seam and fold it towards the back, and then I'm going to do a little tiny zigzag stitch right here to hold that seam down so it doesn't show on the top. So to start the seam on the bottom, I'll do that later. Just want to show you this. Flip your facing back and mark your seam where it's supposed to go on the other side. So you're going to mark this seam right here and sew along up to the end of the facing. And notice that the facing is not even with the hem, so make sure you mark the correct line. You're going to sew from here to here. This is what it should look like once you've pinned and marked your hem. They match up like this. So there's that little lip hanging out. You see it right here. Okay, so my facings are sewn as shown. And you can go ahead and clip the little corner at this point, but we're not going to flip it over yet. I just clipped that. So the bottom is serged, and now I'm going to mark my seam. And starting from where you left off over here, that's how big the seam should be. So I'm gonna mark it and flip that over, and press my seam and top stitch it. Now my seam on the bottom is done. I started from the tip here, and I usually leave my tails when I'm doing my top stitch longer, because that way I can bring them over to the back so there's no tails hanging. And I usually just tie them on the back. I'll do the same thing for the other side. I'm sure you don't need to watch me doing that. And then the final step after that's done, well, the semi-final step is gonna be to do the top stitching. And according to the pattern, the top stitching on the collar, on the rest of the collar, is going to be from the collar point all the way down. And the way I'm going to do it is so that it doesn't come out ugly, because I don't know why, but the bobbin thread seems to be a little ugly sometimes. I'm going to start my top stitching here, go all the way up to that point, up to this point. And then I'm going to continue it, break it off, continue it on the top on this side, because this is the side that's going to show. So that's why I want to do it on top here and then on top here. And finally, here it is, the beautiful jean jacket all finished. All my top stitching done. The final step was to do the top stitching from here up to here, and then up to the lapel and up to the corner there of the lapel where it meets with the collar. I tacked down my facing to the arm so it doesn't stick out. And this is it, folks. The only thing left to do is I might be bold and try to do a buttonhole and attach a real button, or maybe I'll just attach a snap. This is it.